Donald Trump arrives in Milwaukee for the Republican National Convention after surviving an assassination attempt. He says he has rewritten his speech to call for unity. President Biden urges an end to the political violence. The dollar gains, treasuries fall. Investors raise bets that Trump will win re-election following the shooting this weekend. Plus, China's economy growth slows. It's the slowest pace in 5 quarters, piling pressure on Beijing to boost support measures. Let's take a look at how this is all being factored into this morning's markets. In some ways, a shrug of the shoulders from European markets. Other factors, other than the politics, having a bigger impact, you could argue. So at the moment, futures in the United States are barely budging. Here, European equity markets are barely budging. The CAC 40 is actually where the real story is. For European equities this morning, the biggest story is actually China and what is happening with the luxury sector, and that is what's being priced in here in Europe. The Spanish market down by 0.6%, despite what was a fantastic weekend for Spanish sport. So let's talk about what's happening across assets. I want to show you the S&P barely budging. It was a fade Friday into the closing bell in the United States. This morning we're picking up a little bit. No real reaction to Trump. Not much of a reaction to the Trump story in the US 10-year yield either. We'll see how that changes. The dollar up barely. The dollar index up by 0.1%. The story out of Europe this morning is China, the slowdown in growth there, plus also a story out of Burberry and a story out of Swatch as well. You can see how that's rippling through into some of the other names. Richemont down by 3.5% this morning. The luxury sector is being affected, but LVMH is down pretty hard as well. So that is what is happening here in Europe. That's the picture. Let's get started.
Newsmakers and market movers. This is The Pulse with Francine Lacqua.
So Francine is off this morning. Good morning, I'm Guy Johnson. Welcome to The Pulse. We're live from London. We've got a lot going on this morning. You've got to factor in the politics to how you're thinking about what is going to happen next in the United States. Clearly, this weekend's events having a significant effect. One stock that is certainly having an impact, seeing an impact from this week's events is Trump Media. As you can see, that stock pricing in what looks to be a more certain victory come November for the former president. So Donald Trump surviving the assassination attempt this weekend. We are going to see maybe in effect that could be a slower burn, I suspect, than maybe you would have seen, judging by the headlines, you would have anticipated, judging by the headlines. But you could argue, actually, the biggest effect came in this story, actually after the first debate, when Biden stumbled and people became more convinced of that Donald Trump victory. Anyway, Donald Trump arriving in Milwaukee. The RNC, the Republican National Convention, is about to get underway. We understand that he is rewriting his speech. The big focus now, in so many ways, is on the U.S. Secret Service, now facing intense public scrutiny and several investigations. President Biden is urging unity, sort of predictably condemning the violence. We saw that in an Oval Office address last night.
In America, we resolve our differences at the battle box. You know, that's how we do it, at the battle box, not with bullets. The power to change America should always rest in the hands of the people, not in the hands of a would-be assassin.
We're joined to discuss all of this by Carlota Encina, Senior Analyst for the US and Transatlantic Relations at the Elcano Royal Institute. Also with me here on set, Bloomberg's Senior Investigations writer Stephanie Baker. Stephanie, what changed this weekend?
I think everything changed, at least for the near term. You know, as you mentioned, Trump is apparently tearing up his speech. He was planning to attack Biden, and now it looks like he's going to deliver a much more disciplined speech focused on unity. I think he'll probably sound much more presidential than we've heard him sounding recently. I mean, I think it has a huge effect on calls for Biden to step aside because of his age. I think that is going to be put aside for the near future, and I think it impacts fundraising for both campaigns. I think you're going to see an uptick for the Trump campaign in terms of donations. And as we know, there had been a freeze on a lot of donations to the Biden campaign. So I think it looks like a very different campaign.
Carlota, what is your reaction? What do you think? What is different this Monday morning following what we saw in Pennsylvania?
I think what's different is that the Republican Party is more united than it's been before of the assassination attempt. And even more skeptics are more behind former President Trump. For example, a sign of unity is that Nikki Haley will speak at the Republican National Convention, and she was initially not among the list of speakers. But on the other hand, I think Republicans are still divided on how to respond to this. I mean, on the one hand, for some of them, it is time to tone down their rhetoric, but other wants to express anger and outrage, and also wants to point a finger of blame at Democrats and President Biden. So I think right now, I mean, it's true that Trump has a political opportunity to present himself as someone who can rise above the attacks on his life and unite the country. And I think it is important to watch the vice presidential decision that Trump has to make. I mean, if he chooses, for example, somebody like J.D. Vance, who is expressing at this moment anger and outrage, or if he chooses someone else that will try to unite the country. So that decision, I think, is going to be very important and will tell us something about the Trump campaign. And on the Democratic side, I mean, most of them believe that this entire atmosphere of political violence has, of course, begun by Donald Trump, but they are realizing that there is an absolutely new landscape for them.
Carlota, what is the message? What lesson should Europe learn from what we've just seen in the United States? We see political fragmentation, political extremes in Europe. We watch what happens in the United States. Is that something that we should fear here in Europe as well?
Absolutely. I mean, just remind that last week we were at Washington, D.C. We were at the NATO summit, and the Biden administration was trying to send this message to the allies that the America is strong and that the U.S. leadership is strong. But right now, I mean, the U.S. seems to be the least political stable of all the great powers. And this is coming at a time when the country, the U.S. and also the world face the greatest external threat. So in some way, the country has to find its way back to the stability that a superpower requires. So allies and European allies are very much worried about the political situation and the U.S. and also the rivals. I mean, China, maybe Russia. I'm sure that they want to take advantage of this situation.
Yeah. Stephanie, let's carry on that conversation and that point. Europe feels divided as well. Europe feels like it's going to the extremes. We've just seen what's happening in France. We see it in Italy. We see the right rising. We see huge divergences. You've certainly seen that in France. We've seen political violence in the United States. What is the translation? Can I compare Europe and the United States right now in terms of the extremes that we are seeing?
Well, you know, the ultimate irony is the UK had gone through this period of incredible division and has now come out of it with, a sweeping Labour victory and much less division. Not to say that the divisions in the UK are over by any chance, but, the UK went through that process, and whether or not, we're going to see that happen in France and other parts of Europe where they have to go through this process of dealing with the populist right and realizing that the divisions are so unproductive. I think it's really hard to compare Europe to the United States. I think what's happening in the U.S. is so different. Trump is such a unique character. He's such a unique political figure. And I think this assassination, again, changes him as a political figure.
Yep.
I mean, it feeds into his narrative that he's the victim of political persecution. And I think that, that only reinforces that message, as part of his campaign. And how he navigates that, how he manages that narrative. Can he do it by kind of forging a middle path, not sounding divisive, but using that narrative of political persecution?
Carlota, let me ask you the final question related to what Stephanie has just said. In some ways, the path forward for Trump seems in some ways straightforward. Maybe he does tack back towards the centre. Maybe this is his moment to be able to do that. But that leaves the Democrats in a really difficult position. What do they do? Do they continue with Joe Biden? Do they look for another candidate? How do they tackle that story? If Trump can achieve that, and bringing Nikki Haley back into the fold as well maybe helps with that narrative. What do the Democrats now do? Do they stick with Biden? Do they risk further political chaos by changing riders this close to the election in November?
There are a lot of doubts. I think prominent Democrats believe that the conversation about President Biden and whether he should stay in the race is over. Just think about President Biden staying in the race. I mean, he will have to demonstrate presidential vigor even more. On the other hand, you have Democrats that are concerned about security during this campaign. But let me focus on the voters. I mean, you can hear members of the Congress and political experts, they think that this means that the race is over and Democrats are worried about this. But when you talk to voters, they don't see clearly that kind of movement in their voting. I mean, it is not that the horse race will significantly shift because the electorate is too polarized. Among the voters, there is a sense more of regret about where the country is, no, and also a real hope for a different conversation. And we saw this even after the presidential debate, because the numbers didn't move that much. So everybody is exhausted, and they want to see a different campaign among Democrats and among Republicans.
Maybe this weekend is the catalyst for that. Carlota, thank you very much indeed. Carlota Encina, Senior Analyst for US and Transatlantic Relations at the Elcano Royal Institute. And, of course, our ongoing thanks to Bloomberg Senior Investigations writer, get those words out, Stephanie Baker. Coming up, we'll talk about the market reaction. The Trump trade heating up. You're not getting a big market reaction this morning. In some ways, you already got that post the debate. We'll talk more, though, about how markets are reacting to this story and all the other stories we need to factor into our thinking this week. That's next. This is Bloomberg. One hour, 14 minutes into the equity market session here in Europe, Monday the 15th. We've got a lot to factor into our thinking this morning. Obviously, what happened in Pennsylvania over the weekend, the attempted assassination on Donald Trump, is something you need to be thinking about. But Powell's going to be speaking a little bit later on to David Rubenstein. Think about that. Think about the impact that could have as well. We're going to have the earnings season continuing. Goldman Sachs is going to be reporting numbers a little bit later on as well. All of this needs to be factored into your thinking this Monday morning, particularly at a time when actually maybe liquidity is beginning to dry up a little bit as the summer season kind of kicks off. Subitha Subramaniam, partner and chief economist at Sarasin and Partners, joins me around the table, as does Bloomberg's Justina Lee. Good morning to you both. Subitha, let's start with you and think about kind of what happened this weekend and what really in some ways did and didn't change. The Trump trade was already on. The Trump trade was on because of what we saw in the debate and the stumbling Joe Biden in that debate. How did this weekend change, do you think, that narrative?
I think it's just increased the probability of a clean sweep of the Republicans. It's not just that the Republicans take the presidency, but they also take both houses of Congress. And that really gives them enormous power to put forward the agenda. So I think we could now see with greater probability that you have, a very clear agenda from the Republican Party in terms of deregulation, in terms of tariffs, and in terms of just the government deficit trajectory.
So a cautious reaction this morning. Do you think that caution changes, though? Do you think we start to now, as we work our way through, Justina, what's just been described, this potential clean sweep, this policy of immigration that comes to a halt, this policy of tariffs that maybe increases, that changes the inflation narrative, maybe quite significantly, not now, but further down the road? Do you think the market starts to get to grips with the granularity of that now and how it thinks about it?
Yeah, because I think what's interesting is we always see the first reaction in the bond market, and we have seen kind of Treasury yields going up, the bond yield curve steepening and the dollar going up, and all of that has been about Trump's kind of fiscal policy and the prospects of more deficits. And I think in the equities market, that feed through tends to be a little bit less direct because there are a lot of factors going on. But if we are talking about the chances, of a Republican sweep, then maybe we can start talking about, stocks that are maybe more regulation sensitive, right? Or, like the renewable energy sector or electric vehicles, like all these sectors that have received a lot of support under the Biden administration. Like, will we start to see a reaction in that part of the market as well?
Let's talk about the tariffs in a little bit more detail. If we do see a government that comes in that is more aggressive than the Biden administration, which is already fairly aggressive on the tariff story around China and elsewhere, is that inflationary? If we are going to see a tighter immigration policy, Is that going to be inflationary? Does a tighter immigration policy also maybe detract from the growth narrative that we've seen in the United States, which has felt like it has been in some ways driven by the immigration narrative as well? Kind of process all of that for me, build that into the model for me.
So I think one cannot really divorce the tariff decisions from the fact that the U.S. government is now running a deficit that is just really unsustainable. I think if you look into the next 10 years, the deficit in the U.S. is roughly 6% of GDP. Now, tariffs are one way to pay for the deficit, and I think there is very little room for maneuver in terms of the tariffs. If Trump's Tax Cut and Jobs Act, of 2017 do not expire, then the bill for the U.S. government is about $4.7 trillion, and they have to pay for this. This means that the deficit is actually going to be higher than even 6% that the CBO currently projects. So if you go back and look at the tariffs, yes, 10% of, 10% universal tariff on all imports, 60% on China. Even if they do this, you have, it is inflationary. There'll be some offset in terms of the dollar rising, but there's also, it's not going to fully pay for the spending that's coming through. And if you add on to that additional defense spending that the U.S. has now committed to, it's going to be a very challenging sort of outlook in terms of just public finances and inflation.
Can't we just get rid of the Inflation Reduction Act? Isn't that the way you just solve some of this problem? Isn't that going to be something that the Trump administration is going to be very keen to deal with early on?
Yes, so you could sort of sunset some of the provisions in the Inflation Reduction Act. It just does not pay for the full scale of what's coming through in terms of the, Tax Cut and Jobs Act of 2017. $4.7 trillion is a large amount of money that they have to find somewhere. And, even if you just sunset some of the provisions, they can't actually offset all of them because some of them are just tax credits that are just not going to go away. Some of it has already come into play. So I don't think they can actually, get rid of the IRA.
OK. How do we think about a Fed in a Trump era? How do we think about the relationship between Jay Powell and Donald Trump? How do we think about the Fed's ability to continue to cut rates were it to start in September as the market currently is pricing?
Yeah, it's interesting because the Fed really is at a crossroad now because, if anything, last week's data made everyone sure that we're going to get that rate cut in September. Now, of course, the Fed is meant to be, apolitical, and they will definitely kind of be thinking about that. But if it is pretty clear that, we are going to get a Trump presidency and that's going to be inflationary. We have started hearing market strategists wondering if that will somehow kind of factor its way into the Fed's calculation.
What do you think about that? The market's currently pricing in two. We get 2 rate cuts this year. You then get Donald Trump elected. What does the Fed then do? Can it carry on? Can it deliver some of the rate cuts we were anticipating this year, next year? Is this a two-and-done rate cycle? What do we think about the kind of the trajectory for the Fed and where it's ultimately going?
I think the Fed's in a bind. It has to set out a clear path and then carry it through. So what it sees right now is a labour market that's weakening. That's great as far as the Fed's concerned because the jobs market is taking the pressure off wages. We saw with the inflation data that housing market is starting to cool and rental inflation is coming down. So we have a material catch down in shelter inflation. And so that'll help the Fed. I think the Fed will seek to remain apolitical. And I think our view is that they just basically go for one rate cut every quarter predictably, and they set out their path very clearly so they're not hijacked by political events, that come into play. The economy is starting to cool. The U.S. is growing slightly below trend. If you factor into take into account the immigration you've talked about, that really just means that in the short term, the U.S. potential is actually higher than 2%. It's somewhere around 2.25%. So even if the U.S. is growing somewhere between 1.5% to 2%, it's cooling the labor market, pulling down wages, and this really helps the Fed in terms of just setting out its course. Jay Powell has done a great job. And I think, he needs to just see it through.
Subitha, thanks very much indeed for stopping by to see us. Thank you very much indeed. Subitha Subramaniam from Sarasin and Partners. And, of course, our thanks to Bloomberg's Justina Lee. Coming up, a slowdown for the Chinese economy piles pressure on Xi Jinping as the ruling Communist Party in China meets this week to determine its policy direction for the next 5 years. The plenum kicks off today. We'll talk about it next. This is Bloomberg. Let's talk about what's happening in China. The latest data out of the country shows GDP growth weakening a little more than expected. We're now at 4.7% in the second quarter. Let's bring in Bloomberg's Jill Desis to talk about what we should be taking away from these numbers. What should we be taking away from these numbers? What really stands out, Jill?
Really, it's those retail sales figures that are dragging down these overall GDP numbers and I think causing a lot of concern about the trajectory of China's economy right now. I mean, rising 2% year on year in the month, it's really just not a very good sign for the state of domestic demand. We know that this has been under continuous challenge because of issues within the property sector in particular, but it does seem like recent government efforts to try to revitalize that sector, try to pull it out of its crisis, aren't really doing the job. Meanwhile, while you've seen these increases in industrial production that look pretty solid, that's an industry that's really been kind of holding up the Chinese economy this year. There's a lot of uncertainties there about what happens with trade, if there are new trade barriers that are erected around China, particularly from the U.S. and Europe. So that continues to be a concern going into the end of the year, particularly because it seems like another Trump administration, which is, Trump has promised to enact more tariffs, is, very difficult. So it's just a really difficult point for the economy to kind of deal with right now.
Jill Deeses, thank you very much indeed. Bit of information you may be interested in. US 30-year yield rising above the 2-year for the first time since January. Part of the Trump effect. We'll talk about the Trump effect next after what we saw this weekend. That story is coming up. We'll have the latest for you. This is Bloomberg. Monday the 15th, welcome to The Pulse. I'm Guy Johnson in for Francine Lacqua. Let's talk about your top stories this morning. Donald Trump arriving in Milwaukee for the Republican National Convention. This, of course, after surviving an assassination attempt. He says that he has rewritten his speech to call for unity. President Biden urging an end to political violence. The 30-year in the United States rising above the 2-year for the first time since January as investors raise bets that Donald Trump will win re-election following the shooting. Plus, China's economy grows at its slowest pace in 5 quarters, piling pressure on Beijing to boost support measures. Let's talk about our top story this morning in a little bit more detail. President Biden has appealed for unity after the attempted assassination of the former president, Donald Trump, this weekend.
While we may disagree, we are not enemies. We're neighbors. We're friends, co-workers, citizens, and most importantly, we're fellow Americans. We must stand together. Yesterday's shooting at Donald Trump's rally in Pennsylvania calls on all of us to take a step back. Take stock of where we are, how we go forward from here.
Understandably, the international condemnation of the attack has been swift and strong, with world leaders calling for an end to political violence. Let's get more on this story. Let's bring in Bloomberg's Kevin Whitelaw and Bloomberg's Ollie Crook. Kevin, first of all, let's deal with the story out of the United States. Political violence is not new. We've become more and more accustomed to it recently. This felt like a huge security failure, though. A former president nearly assassinated, an incident that would have caused a huge, huge impact on U.S. politics. Talk to me about kind of how America decompresses from this, where the fingers are going to be pointed and how we recover from it.
Well, already the Secret Service is facing a number of questions about how exactly someone was able to get onto a rooftop that had a clear view of the stage and within range to be able to fire shots like that. So that's going to be something that is going to be federal investigations with multiple agencies involved. But you're also hearing calls for Congress and others to do their own independent investigations. And of course, like any incident, it's also already it immediately spawned a whole set of conspiracy theories. And so it's going to take a lot of time and effort to comb through exactly where the breakdown was. But even more urgently, but all of these federal agencies are going to have to figure out how to make sure that they have stepped up protection for both candidates as the Republicans go into their convention this week and the Democrats next month.
Ollie, condemnation of the attack, understandable, and we've seen it from a number of leaders across Europe and across the world. Nevertheless, political extremes are becoming more normal on both sides of the Atlantic, and you do wonder what the message from this attack we saw this weekend is for Europe.
Yeah, and listen, we're going to see this trickle through over the days to come. I don't think it's worked itself anywhere near the system in the United States, much less on the global stage. But overall, the sort of leaders across the world, their sort of message has been one of, condolence, of sympathy, but really that violence is never the solution to a political problem. We heard from a number of leaders, including Olaf Scholz here in Germany, saying that the attack was despicable, that it threatens, the democracy. We look for some of the reactions from some of the countries that we have particular interest in. We look at China. They gave a very sort of terse but very sort of sober message, saying that they expressed concern and sympathy for Donald Trump. For a slightly more colorful reaction, we look to the Kremlin, where we heard from the spokesman there saying that after numerous attempts to remove candidate Trump, he says, from the political arena using first legal tools, the courts, prosecutors, etc., it was obvious to all outside observers that his life was in danger. We should say that he went on to say that Russia does not believe that the attempt to eliminate Trump was organized by the current authorities, i.e. Biden, but he was saying that basically the political atmosphere is what has sort of caused this. And it's not just something we heard from Russia, which we take, of course, with a fairly large grain of salt. It's a message that we heard from Nigel Farage over the weekend, who is saying that the narrative that has been put there about Trump by these liberals that oppose him is so nasty, unpleasant, that I think it almost, he says, almost encourages this type of behavior. We heard similar things from Javier Milei, from Geert Wilders. So this is still working itself through, but already very quickly politicized before we even have any clear motive for what this shooting was. For these leaders, of course, they are going to be watching that very closely. They need stability from the United States, particularly when it is a protagonist in two major wars. But of course, Guy, this will bear massively, likely, we won't know for a few days, on who is going to be sitting across the table from them come January after this election.
Kevin, it's going to be fascinating to watch how this does change the centre of gravity in America. Ollie's talking about kind of how we should watch what is happening here and the impact it could have elsewhere. The most immediate effect potentially could be felt this evening, with Donald Trump potentially tacking back to the centre ground, maybe distancing himself from the extremes. How big an effect could this have on politics? The kind of the centre of gravity of politics. Are both sides going to tack back to the centre, and ultimately, is that what maybe voters want?
I mean, it's almost certainly what a lot of voters want. I do think, if anything, it constrains President Biden a little bit. President Biden had been in the process of mounting some very withering attacks on Donald Trump as he tried to bounce back from that disastrous debate performance. And now he's going to have to modulate those words and be a little more careful to make sure it doesn't sound like he's trying to somehow pile on to those attacks. For Donald Trump, he's got the same choice. He can either tack toward the center, but you've seen, obviously, particularly from some of his backers, some very strong rhetoric, even in the wake of the assassination, accusations of somehow some kind of involvement from even the White House. And so I do think that the extreme rhetoric on both sides is going to continue despite this. That's only, but the two men at the top of each ticket could set a somewhat different tone.
Ollie, what is the Trump trade for Europe now? How does Europe manage this process? If Trump becomes more likely, how is Europe prepared? How should Europe prepare? And how far along in that preparation process do you think we really are?
Well, Guy, I mean, it's a major concern, obviously, for Europe and for really every nation on the planet, because, what the U.S. does is of huge consequence everywhere. But I'll just take you back to just 2 weeks ago when I was in Kyiv and we spoke with President Zelensky and asking him, do you know what Donald Trump means when he says, well, I'll have this war ended in 24 hours? And Zelensky said, basically, no, I don't have any idea, and I would like to know, because I cannot, as the leader of Ukraine, have any surprises going into the calculus. I think that with Donald Trump come a great number of surprises that a lot of people and a lot of leaders are trying to parse and understand. The peace plan, if we believe Putin as well, who spoke just a few days ago, saying that he also has no idea what's in there. So I think it comes with a great deal of wild cards, Guy, and I think that so much of the Trump sort of administration comes down to sort of some of the impalpable things of kind of rhetoric and kind of feelings within the United States rather than policy. I think that, we're just beginning the process of seeing how this works its way through. And of course, Guy, it distracts from the main U.S. political discussion going into the weekend, which is, will Biden be the candidate?
Yep. And I don't know we have the answer or any closer to the answer after this weekend. Kevin Whitelaw, Ollie Crook, thank you very much indeed. Some parallels, as we've just been discussing, drawn between what is happening in Washington, what's happening in Pennsylvania, and what is happening in Paris, in other parts of Europe. Right-wing politicians coming to the forefront. What we saw in the French election, obviously, the extremes were front and centre. And in some ways, we avoided one but got the other. We don't know yet what the next French government is going to look like. The new Popular Front, the left-wing coalition, the one most seats in France's snap election, struggling to figure out how it is going to unite, to come up with a candidate for a prime minister. Let's get some idea of what happens next and what goes on in France over the next few days. Arthur Delaporte, a socialist member of the French Parliament, joins us now. Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Delaporte, for joining us. How far away are we from getting a new French president? A new French prime minister?
We are working out on a name altogether to have a kind of real prime minister who will be able to make large majorities in the parliament, because, as you mentioned, we don't have the total majority. We have only a relative majority with around 180 or 190 MPs. So we have to build then coalitions, and we are working on a name who will be able to reunite the parliament, and we are still discussing today.
What names do you think should be put forward? What do you think? Who are the front runners in your mind?
We, the Socialists, put the name of Olivier Faure, who is the leader of the Socialist Party, but some other put another name this weekend, but it wasn't a consensual name, so we are still trying to find someone, the good person.
Hollande, Faure, these are names that I'm hearing being mentioned as well. What do you think about those names?
No, it's not probable that it could be a name of François Hollande, for instance, because he's not able to unite the new Popular Front, and the first goal for us is to have someone who reunifies the left-wing coalition, so the new Popular Front, and then someone who is able to build coalition inside the parliament with the centre, for instance, and the Macronists to make the bill pass.
OK, so Macron has said he won't work with the far left. What do the socialists do? Which way do you look? Do you look left or right? Do you tack back to the centre? How do you think about what the debate is going to look like within your party about kind of which side do you pick?
Today we are trying to make a coalition with the left, but tomorrow we will have to work with the centre and with the right in parliament, because if we don't do this, we will have difficulties to pass bills inside the parliament.
What do you think the lesson is from elsewhere in Europe? The Germans are really struggling with a broad coalition. Do you think a broad coalition could work in France?
No, I don't think we have the culture of broad coalition. And today, if the socialists, for instance, make an alliance with the centre, we don't have a majority. So we would have to make a coalition with the right. But today, the French right is not a liberal right; it's an extremist right. Plus, not far from the extreme. So it's impossible for us to make a kind of broad coalition with the centre and the right. So we still have, for first step, to make a coalition, to consolidate our coalition, the new Popular Front, which is with the ecologists, with communists, and with La France Insoumise. And then, when we have a prime minister, then to build a larger coalition inside the parliament.
Should we assume that the pension reform that France has struggled with is now dead, that is over? How central is that to your thinking?
I think that the pension reform was one of the biggest measures we were putting out, and this is one of what we will try to do when we'll be in office. But we will still have to make a majority on the abolition of the pension reform, which was really unpopular. And so this is one of the difficulties we will be facing with in the next few months. But first of all, we have to win the power. And to win the power, to be in office, we have to be appointed by Macron, and then not to have, we say, motion de censure, which is a way to make the government full.
This is a financial program. This is a financial network. People who are watching this are watching France and trying to figure out how the maths is going to work in terms of the spending of the next French government. What assurances can you give financial markets that you will not tear up the spending plans, that you will not spend too much, that you will not cause a fiscal crisis?
The first thing to know is that this is our program, but we have to make a majority in the parliament. So it won't be the program which will be put in final, because we need to build majorities. So maybe it will be a bit different, but the biggest goals are the same. Hiring wages and hiring the minimum wage is one of the first steps we have to do, and the pension reform, I would say, is the other one to be put in first. And to finance this, we will do a tax on super profits and increase the solidarity tax on wealth, which will bring maybe around 30 billion euros. But our aim is to have solid public finance, and we are not irresponsible guys who are wanting just the power for the power. We socialists ran the country during between 2012 and 2017, and we improved the stability of the public finance. So we are not irresponsible leaders.
On that note, we will leave it. Arthur, thank you very much indeed. Arthur Delaporte, Socialist member of the French Parliament, we really appreciate your time. We'll look forward to developments in France. Coming up, talking of France, European luxury stocks under significant pressure today. We've seen disappointing updates from Swatch and Burberry. There's a ripple effect of both of those two into names like Richemont and LVMH. We'll talk about the sector next. This is Bloomberg. So, good morning. The story in equity markets this morning in Europe is not about how to price in what we saw over the weekend in the United States and the attempted assassination on Donald Trump. It's this. It's what is happening with the luxury space. So we've had a profit miss from Swatch, and we've had a huge change at Burberry. Burberry's down by 15%, and this follows a really tough year already. Swatch is down by 11%. It missed numbers. That's a China story. But Burberry is changing the leader. We've got a new CEO. Ackroyd is stepping down. Schliemann is coming in. What other changes are we going to be seeing flowing from that? The dividend has been suspended. This is a huge shift for Burberry. So let's bring in Bloomberg's Chloe Melly to talk about what is going on here. Look, this follows a really difficult period. Jonathan Ackroyd has been in for 2.5 years. It hasn't worked. Why hasn't it worked? Why are we where we are now?
Well, there are two types of challenges, really, that is facing Burberry. So the first one is that it's quite company-specific in terms of them trying to have this brand revival strategy, this brand turnaround, becoming a high-end label. That's a strategy that now they're walking back from, and they want to target kind of less wealthy customers now. And then in terms of the market-wide issues, there is demand is sluggish across the luxury sector. And it's also a particularly difficult quarter this quarter because the comparatives from a year earlier are quite tough. Last year, for the same period, China was reopening after COVID. Yeah. That was really boosting growth for all the luxury sector. Now, obviously, that has faltered and we don't see that anymore. So Burberry is very much facing those specific issues, and then also the wider market downturn. So
you can understand why the stock is down. The dividend suspension is obviously hugely significant. But normally when you get these kinds of changes, the market goes, OK, so we're bottoming out here and we can start to improve from here. Maybe we get a kitchen sinking in the next quarter from the new CEO who comes in and kind of tells it as it is and kind of gives a clearer picture. But nevertheless, that's a big reaction from the market. Is the bottom in sight for Burberry?
Well, the recovery, I mean, Burberry said that if the situation continues, it will report a loss for the first 6 months of the year and report full-year profit below expectations. The chairman also said the luxury market was much more challenging than expected. So there's not that much optimism. No. And there's also been some media reports about jobs potentially being on the line as well. So it's not super optimistic. There are some expectations that the second half might be a little bit better with tourism recovering and then also comparatives being a bit easier. So we'll have to see.
We certainly shall. Be interested to see kind of what they do on the designer fronts. Chloe Mellon joining us on what is happening with Burberry. Swatch down pretty hard today, circa 10%, but Burberry's down by 15%. Big down day for the luxury sector. Coming up, Bloomberg understands that Alphabet is looking to make its biggest ever acquisition, which is fascinating. It's in the cybersecurity space. Details to follow. This is Bloomberg. Let's talk about M&A. Let's talk about what is happening with big tech. Alphabet, we understand here at Bloomberg, is in talks to acquire the cybersecurity startup Wiz. We're told the transaction could total as much as $23 billion, making it the largest ever acquisition for the Google parent company. Let's bring in Charlie Wells to discuss this. Charlie, I saw this headline this morning and I thought, big tech, I thought they weren't allowed to do this kind of thing.
Yeah, I mean, there's antitrust issues here that make these sort of huge acquisitions rare. I mean, if you want to go back to Google history, the last time they made such an enormous acquisition was in 2012. That was from Motorola Mobility, but that was only $12.5 billion. Yeah. Funny mentioning Motorola because that just sort of speaks to that era. Now we're talking cloud. And look, it's just looking like Google is feeling the pressure. They are a distant third to Amazon.
Catch-up trade, isn't it?
Maybe they're going to buy their way out of that.
So just talk me through kind of how the regulatory story is going to work here.
I mean, look, yeah, Google already faces, or Alphabet already faces kind of two challenges from the Department of Justice. So they are awaiting a verdict on a lawsuit about search dominance. They've got another suit that was filed last year about ad tech. So they've got to be alive to this. But this just speaks to how important cloud is in this moment when AI needs increasing cloud and cloud security.
Talking about how kind of the market has shifted, Apple, let's talk about that. China has been in the past so super important to this company. Feels like maybe the center of gravity maybe shifting to India.
Interesting. So a person familiar with the matter told Bloomberg that sales in India were up 33% through to March from the year before, so hitting a record of $8 billion. And that is really important for Apple because they want that diversification. They want that diversification as far as the consumer, willing to potentially buy a more expensive phone, but also manufacturing as trade tensions ramp up.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting to see how you could kind of factor in the Trump presidency into this. Maybe that story is something.
It's all relevant.
Precisely. This is going to be something that we can fold in maybe there. Charlie, thank you very much indeed. Charlie Wells on what is happening with the tech landscape right now. Two interesting stories to keep an eye on. Actually, I think both stocks pre-market not actually moving that much. One area where we are seeing maybe a little bit of action is in what is going on in the Treasury market. Now, Japan was closed overnight, so we've got a kind of later open. But this is what you're looking at right now. So at the moment, the bid comes through at the front end. So that's where yields are moving a little bit lower. Now, that could be that feels maybe more like the Fed trade, which is interesting because Jerome Powell is going to be speaking a little bit later on to Carlyle co-founder and Bloomberg peer-to-peer interviewer David Rubenstein. So keep an eye on that a little bit later on. So that's going to be something that's coming up at the Economic Club of New York. That may be just the front end, but look at what is happening at the back end. So the back end move is really quite significant. That maybe is where the market is pricing in the Trump trade, which is going to be really interesting. There is this fear in the market that maybe Donald Trump is inflationary, maybe he is going to deliver significantly greater spending, and that is where you price that in towards the back end of the market. So at the moment, we've now started, and look at the yields at the front to the back. So what you've now got is this kind of parity now between the 2s and the 30s, which is really significant in terms of the disinversion that we are starting to see. Elsewhere, equity markets reasonably becalmed. European equity markets are actually moving more on what is happening in the luxury space right now. We look forward to the US Open a little bit later on. Danny Berger, Manus Cranning, going to be taking you through the build-up to that. The brief is next. This is Bloomberg.